Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 79, which will explore the very important biological concept of form and function as it applies to animals. Now this is the first episode of my second series on animal physiology, which will continue to explore the various fundamental aspects of the animal body that I couldn't fit into the first series. Now compared to the plants and the fungi, the animals are relatively complicated. Animals have a much greater variety and complexity of their tissues, and unlike both the plants and the fungi, the animals are extremely mobile. They can move around the landscape with ease, and this adds a whole new social and predatory dynamic to their environment. Because of this relative complexity, there's much more stuff that I have to cover here to fully explore the basics of the animals, hence this second series on animal physiology. After this series, I'll start to explore the orders and the families of the kingdom Animalia itself. So if that sounds cool to you, then, awesome, let's get this episode started, let's get this playlist started, and then after that, we'll dig into kingdom Animalia. Where the first episode in animal physiology was about animal development, this second first episode will explore animal form and function as it pertains to the mature animal. So this means tissues and organs and adaptations and life strategies, body size, homeostasis, interactions with the environment, all that good stuff. And because all of this is very fundamental, you'll be able to take a lot of the information that you hear today and apply it to the previous 6 episodes. So if you listen to this episode, or really if you listen to any episode about a general overarching biological principle like this, you can go back and listen to any earlier episode and apply these concepts. And hopefully you'll understand the material a bit better. You'll make connections between more of the little details, and you'll have a better grasp of the information. Now, with all of this housekeeping out of the way, let's start episode 79. Animal form and function, or to put it another way, their anatomy and physiology, is the product of their evolution, of countless adaptations that allow the animals to fit into their environments, into their ecological niches. For any given animal or population or species, the environment is a literal wilderness of both biological and physical variables. And these variables, be they threats, dangers, or opportunities, like for food or a chance to mate, these are all influencing the animal's evolution. Virtually every variable, be it temperature, humidity, a specific microbial pathogen, seasonal changes, whatever it is, these variables apply selection pressures onto the animal populations that live in that environment. And as the animal populations respond evolutionarily to these pressures, their bodies change. Adaptations that are useful are preserved or optimized, and less useful traits are minimized, retooled, or lost entirely. The adaptations that are preserved allow the animal population to survive better and to reproduce with better chances of success within whichever environment they happen to live. And as time goes on, and these adaptations accumulate, and as traits that aren't helpful in the environment are stripped away or repurposed, the animal's morphology can change. The animal population is molded into its environment, not just chemically, but also physically, so that it can thrive there, wherever there happens to be. Now, you should understand that this capability to adapt is fundamentally extremely powerful and really important. It's important because it's actually one of the defining features of life. Scientists, biologists have created this philosophical, semi-arbitrary list of criteria for what defines life, and one of those criteria is the ability for some phenomenon to respond evolutionarily to its environment. It can adapt to evolutionary pressures by having hereditary information selected over time. It's also important because this capacity to adapt has created literally all of the biological diversity and biogeographical distribution of all of Earth life. All the life that we see today is a result of this ability for reproducing organic structures to adapt and diversify. But it's also important to understand that all of these adaptations, as powerful and amazing as they are, they're only adaptations to a specific environment. And that's actually a pretty limited thing. When the environment changes, whether it be over long periods of time due to like the climate oscillations or ice ages, or in short periods of time due to supervolcanoes erupting or meteors impacting the crust, all of the exposed animal populations will find that their current set of adaptations, which may have been useful in the old primordial environment, may not be useful or may even be detrimental in the new environment. So for example, in the early days of the Earth, when the Earth was young and it was populated only by bacteria, the predominant groups of bacteria were methanogens. The weakness that these methanogens had is that they were anaerobic. If they were exposed to oxygen, it was toxic to them. They would die. But fortunately, there wasn't much oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere at this point, until another group of bacteria evolved the ability to photosynthesize. They could harness the energy from sunlight by cracking water molecules, and this would produce some free molecular oxygen. Oxygen, it's reactive, so it bound to like iron and stuff and other oxygen sinks on the surface, and it oxygenated the upper layers of the ocean. But eventually these sinks were kind of full, and there was no more places for the produced oxygen to go. But the bacteria were still photosynthesizing. They were still producing oxygen, so it accumulated in the air. And this saturation of oxygen in the air and water killed off all the methanogens because their environment that they were once comfortable in had turned into an environment that was completely toxic to them. Another example is the asteroid impact that hit 66 million years ago. This impact was devastating, particularly to larger animals. The initial impact created a heat wave that burned up a lot of vegetation, and it made the air temperature boiling, like being in an oven. And this killed off a lot of the larger creatures. Except the impact also threw up giant clouds of dust which blocked out the sunlight, and this cooled the Earth. So you had this giant heat wave followed by this period of cooling and a prolonged winter season effect. And combined, this killed off almost all the dinosaurs. The only ones that survived were those that could fly, the ancestors of the birds, because they could traverse the landscape relatively easily by getting up in the air and searching from an aerial perspective for food and lingering green spaces and anywhere. And so they had a much better chance of survival because they developed adaptations that allowed them to move around this ruined landscape a lot more efficiently. The ancestors to the mammals also survived because at this point, you had a variety of mammals. Some were larger creatures and they were wiped out like the larger dinosaurs. But the ancestors to modern mammals at this point was like a small rodent-like creature that could burrow in the ground. And burrowing in underground tunnels and stuff allowed them to survive these horrible surface conditions. These adaptations allowed them to survive, this terrible period of time and come out the other side. And then, having repopulated this new world, sans dinosaurs, the mammals diversified, produced all of these, amazing adaptations, and created the biodiversity of mammals that we see today. But to emphasize just how important the environment is, perhaps to a point where it's kind of silly, it might be helpful to imagine an animal species being transplanted into a radically different environment, one that looks nothing like its native environment. So imagine a fish adapted to swim aerodynamically, or I should say hydrodynamically, through the water, but it's being transplanted now into a dry desert. The fish is going to die within minutes, if not seconds. It can't tolerate the heat. It needs water to swim around in. It can't move on the sand except for just flopping around. And it doesn't have water flowing over its gills, so it can't breathe. It can't breathe the air because it's a completely different medium. It's much less dense. It's also sucking moisture out of its gills, and the gills need moisture to function, so you can see that all of the fish's adaptations to its aquatic environment are complete liabilities here in the desert. You could also imagine a polar bear from the Arctic being transplanted to a dry desert. The polar bear has white fur that in its native habitat allows it to hide in or blend in with the snow so it can avoid being detected by prey, like a seal as it tries to sneak up and hunt. Here in the desert, white fur will reflect a lot of heat, a lot of light, and so that'll be good for the bear. It might help it stay cool, but the polar bear also has black skin, and that black skin could also absorb some of the light that's not reflected, like infrared, for example. And so the bear would overheat very quickly. You can see how a polar bear would not do well in the desert. Now, in both of these cases, we see animals who have evolved adaptations to their specific environment, adaptations that have been shaped into qualitative traits that are specialized for dealing with the variables of whatever very specific environment they happen to live in. When you talk about the polar bear, you have the white fur. You also have the volume to surface area ratio that helps it retain heat and stay warm. You can get into behavioral dynamics, mating dynamics, how male polar bears will often kill the young of any potential females they run across because they want the female to mate with them and raise their young. All these behaviors, all these behavioral adaptations, and you can see how they fit very clearly into this specific habitat, but not so much into the desert, where they're not hunting seals, where there might be a bit more vegetation, but where the temperature is wildly different. So the larger point I'm trying to make here, perhaps not very well, is that all of these animal adaptations, they involve fitness trade-offs. That's the important point I was trying to build up to. Fitness trade-offs. Pretty much no adaptation is going to be a universally useful trait. If you name any trait of any animal, there's going to be an environment where that trait is not useful, or where it might even be outright detrimental. For example, consider wings. Birds and bats have wings, and this adaptation has opened up a whole new dimension for them. It allows them to travel in the sky, far above the land and away from four-legged predators. It allows them to hunt from the sky, which gives them a powerful visual advantage. It allows them to migrate over huge distances, and to bypass difficult or impassable terrain, and to do all sorts of other things. But their wings are fragile and really bad at digging through the soil. Feathers are relatively delicate, and they can only scrape away the softer upper layers of soil. They're absolutely terrible at digging through more compacted, more root-infused soil. The bird can't use its wings to burrow into the ground and make tunnels, which is how so many rodents and reptiles escape their avian predators. This burrowing trait is itself an adaptation in the rodents and in many reptiles. It's been modified through evolutionary time so that these animals don't just burrow to escape birds, they burrow for many reasons, like to make underground homes and nests, to hibernate and keep warm in the winter, and to escape other more terrestrial predators like foxes or cats. And while having hands that can dig through the soil are very useful traits for this purpose, those types of hands are also very bad at flying. This is a very rough illustration of some fitness trade-offs. The way I'm describing fitness trade-offs right now, I feel like, is very coarse and very superficial. So let me try and find a more elegant and subtle example. Have you ever wondered why a particular animal might lay X amount of eggs and not X plus 5 or X plus 20 eggs? Or why many animals have 2 eyes when 3 or 4 eyes would provide not just redundancy, but also perhaps the ability to see in different frequencies, so see different visual information? Why do animals have this but not that? Why do animals do this but not that? The reason that traits and adaptations appear as they do is because there are energy and resource balances that have to be managed. If you'll consider birds again, think about why a hypothetical bird species would lay 2 or 3 eggs at a time, as opposed to 10 or 20. There are fitness trade-offs here. If the bird laid 20 eggs, that would be a huge resource investment. For the mother bird, producing the 20 eggs in the first place would be very difficult, as it would require a lot of nutrients. If, somehow, all of the eggs were given enough care and attention so that each one hatched into a healthy chick, and keep in mind this is already unlikely because it's a big challenge to produce 20 eggs at once, but if they all hatch into healthy chicks, well, now the mother bird has 20 offspring that she has to feed and raise and protect. So now the mother bird doesn't just have to find food for herself, she has to find food for all 20 chicks. And if she can't do that, then the chicks will start to starve. If they starve, then that huge initial resource investment to make the eggs, that was a waste. Now, if she tries to feed all of her 20 chicks equally, then all of the chicks might be equally malnourished. And all of them would have a similar risk of starving to death. They would all be relatively sickly and probably Each individual offspring bird would probably not have a very good chance of growing up into a healthy, fit, mature individual who could reproduce on their own. And if this happens, if they all starve to death in adolescence, or if none of them grow up to be anything more than weak, sickly juveniles who are unlikely to find a mate, then the mother bird has still wasted all of her time. She's wasted even more time and energy and resources. If she had only produced 2 or 3 eggs in the first place, that's much less of an initial investment, and it's also a lot easier to feed 2 or 3 chicks. And because of this, it's much more likely that these 2 or 3 chicks are going to make it into adulthood as fit, healthy, virile individuals. This example shows how the adaptation to produce a smaller number of eggs can actually result in more offspring making it to adulthood, or at least more offspring making it to adulthood in a healthy, robust enough shape to successfully reproduce and raise offspring of their own. Now, this concept of energy and resource management is universal. It applies to all animals, all organisms, really, in all aspects of their life. Use of energy and resources is the most physics-based aspect of biology that there is. It's remarkably mathematical. Now, obviously, the animals aren't doing, math calculations to determine the best life strategies, but what's going on is that evolutionary pressures tend to shape adaptations into energetically harmonious forms, which do have a kind of mathematic equilibrium. This is demonstrated by the mother bird laying the optimal amount of eggs. Any theoretical ancestor bird that consistently tried to lay 20 eggs and raise 20 chicks at a time would have had overall less success than those that tried to lay and raise a more manageable number of offspring. For another interesting example, consider crickets. Crickets reproduce when the male cricket generates what's called a spermatophore, which is then given to the female cricket for her to eat. The spermatophore is basically a globular gelatinous mass that's filled with sperm, and as the female eats it, the sperm is ingested, and it migrates through her anatomy to her reproductive organs, where the sperm will then fertilize her eggs. A general trend here is that the longer the female spends eating the spermatophore, the more sperm she'll ingest, and the more likely that the male sperm is to fertilize her eggs. There are several aspects of this reproductive strategy that involve fitness trade-offs, or a balancing of variables for maximal reproductive success. First of all, consider that it takes the male about 3 hours to generate a decently sized spermatophore, which can weigh as much as 6% of his adult body mass. Now, the male can potentially make numerous really small spermatophores, but each female that eats a spermatophore will only be ingesting a very small amount of sperm, and this gives the male cricket a pretty low chance of fertilizing her eggs. Alternatively, the male can spend many hours making a huge spermatophore that the female will spend a very long time eating. Now, this strategy is very likely to lead to the female being fertilized, but the initial act of producing such a huge spermatophore, it's a big time investment. It's very time-consuming and very energy-intensive, and during this period, this construction time, the male cricket is very vulnerable to threats. So the male cricket who produces a lot of really small spermatophores, he can do it quickly and he can hop from hiding place to hiding place while he does it, so he's not that exposed. So that's an advantage of that particular strategy, but it's not as likely to lead to fertilization. With this other strategy, the male wants to produce a big spermatophore to really make it likely that his sperm will fertilize the female, but he's also endangering himself doing so. It's also a high-risk strategy, but in a different way. So what's an example? What do we mean when we say that spending a lot of time building the spermatophore puts the cricket at risk? Consider a pathogen and the energy that the cricket would need to mount an immune response to protect itself from that pathogen. So if a male cricket gets infected while he's making the spermatophore, his body has to balance the energy invested into fighting off the pathogen and the energy invested into making more spermatophore. If energy has to be spent fighting off an infection, then the male cricket will necessarily make smaller spermatophores. The sperm packet may be the same size, but the gelatinous mass will be smaller, and the females will spend less time eating them and thus ingest fewer sperm. So the male cricket has to create spermatophores that are properly sized so as to optimize female feeding time, which then optimizes reproductive success, but he also has to create the right number of spermatophores so that he has enough opportunities to reproduce, with sufficiently viable odds of fertilization. And all of this has to be balanced as part of a dance of fitness trade-offs. While the cricket is going through this dance, he's being preyed on by larger insects and rodents and birds. He's exposed to pathogens and fungus that wants to infect him and kill him. So it's all very challenging, and those that succeed are often those who have, by chance or by happenstance, survived the evolutionary pressures thrown their way. And so many others, so many individual animals will die, not having fully matured, not having reproduced, not having been able to raise their own offspring successfully. This is how evolution works. This is how these adaptations get shaped and molded by these pressures to create all these diverse populations. Okay, so now that I've touched on the very basics of this energy investment trade-off aspect of animal evolution, I want to look at the morphological aspects of animals' bodies that offer these functional benefits. I want to look at how form implies function, and how function implies form. Perhaps the most strikingly clear and obvious example of this is the beaks of the finches on the Galapagos Islands. This is what Darwin observed when he was formulating his theory of evolution. Now, each Galapagos Island is populated with different species of plants, and these plants produce different kinds of seeds. The seeds have different sizes, different shells with varying hardness, varying textures, and within the shell there's softer tissue of varying nutritional quality. And most importantly, these seeds are a critical source of food for all of the finches that live on these islands. Now, whatever species of finch we're talking about, all of these species, they've adapted to their island homes by evolving beaks to match the type of food that they have access to. If an island's only available food source is big, thick seeds that are heavy and very hard to break open, then the only finches who will be able to break them open and survive on this island will be the finches with the largest, strongest beaks, those whose adaptations allow them to survive and then thrive in this environment. After many generations of selection pressure, all of the finches on a given island with large, heavy seeds will now have large, strong beaks. These finch populations have been sculpted by evolution to optimally crack open the seeds that they depend on for food. They can't eat nothing else because there is nothing else. So as a population, as a lineage, they either had the choice to develop larger beaks to be able to break open the food that was available, or they could starve and die out, and that would be the end of them. Conversely, other islands had plants that produced smaller seeds, or softer seeds. Now these seeds can clearly be consumed by a finch with a large, strong beak. The big beak is kind of overkill, it's not necessary, it can definitely do the job, but there's a lot left over. But these small, soft seeds can also be consumed by finches with smaller, weaker beaks. And on these islands, developing a larger beak is actually detrimental. It's a waste of resources, because the finch is investing all of these nutrients and all this chemical energy into developing all of the hard tissue in this giant beak that's, 5 times, 10 times more powerful than it needs to be. Over-engineering an organ like this is a waste of resources. Now, in both of these cases, the finches aren't deliberately engineering their beaks, obviously. Evolution is. So when a mutation appears and creates an allele that produces a slightly larger beak, in environments where that kind of beak is more of an advantage, that allele will be preserved in the population, as individuals with it are better able to survive and reproduce and thus pass on the allele compared to those individuals who don't have it. Alright, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about tissues and organ systems. Animals are composed of a variety of interconnected tissues, and the type of tissue and its location has a huge influence in how the animal's body moves and bends and interacts with the environment. The simplest kind of tissue is epithelial tissue, which can be called epithelia or epithelium. The epithelium is composed of tightly packed cells that form thin layers on the outside of the body and on the outside of organs and blood vessels. The outer surface of the epithelium is the apical layer, and the inner surface of the epithelium, which faces the inside of the body, or the inside of the organ, or the inside of the blood vessel, is called the basolateral layer. Now, the basolateral layer is composed of larger cells, which reproduce rapidly through mitosis. These daughter cells move up through the tissue towards the apical surface as they age, as they're getting pushed up by the new cells being continually produced behind them. This basolateral layer of the epithelium is attached to a ground layer of connective tissue. Connective tissue is composed of cells dispersed in a matrix, like a liquid or a gelatinous substance, or a solid, like bone. Different types of connective tissue have different matrices, and they perform significantly different roles in the animal's body. Loose connective tissue is relatively simple, as it consists of a mass of fibrous structures, loosely arranged in sheets or layers. Loose connective tissue exists below the skin, and below the epithelial layers of many organs. In contrast, there's dense connective tissue, which consists of thick collagen fibers that are tightly packed and bundled together to create tissue that's elastic and flexible, but also extremely strong. These collagen fibers compose the extracellular matrix of the connective tissue, as they're produced by rows of fibroblast cells that are packed inside the bundles, nestled between the collagen fibers themselves. This dense, strong, flexible tissue forms the ligaments and the tendons. The ligaments connect bone to bone, often wrapping around and sealing in the cartilage that's positioned between the bones in a joint. Tendons connect the bone to muscle. The bones themselves are also a connective tissue. Bones are a form of supporting connective tissue which literally offers physical, structural support and a degree of mechanical protection. The bone itself consists of osteocytes, or bone cells, which all secrete a mixture of mostly calcium phosphate with a little calcium carbonate that forms solid deposits. These deposits grow together to form the bone. The cartilage that you often see at the ends of long bones or between the vertebrae is also a supportive connective tissue, which is composed of chondrocytes that secrete a proteoglycan and elastin-rich substance that hardens into rubbery, smooth, elastic cartilage tissue. Okay, so loose connective tissue is composed of a soft matrix, like padding or bedding, with loose tangled fibers suspended in a soft gel. Dense connective tissue is composed of a stiffer, harder matrix of parallel rows of collagen fibers. And supportive connective tissue is composed of solid matrix, like calcium phosphate salts. There's also a kind of connective tissue composed of a pure liquid matrix, where the cells are typically free-floating in a fluid solution. The blood is a fluid connective tissue, as it contains cells like erythrocytes that get transported throughout the body's vasculature within the blood itself. The blood fluid is the matrix. Now, beyond the connective tissue, you have the muscle tissue itself, which I talked about in great detail in the previous episode on animal movement. Muscle tissue is unique to animals, and it allows for contraction, which, when built around the proper skeletal framework, allows the animal to move its body in specific ways. Skeletal muscle tissue allows the animal to manipulate its limbs, so as to move around the environment and avoid predators, find food to eat, or find a mate to reproduce with. Smooth muscle wraps around some of the animal's organs, mostly those in the digestive tract, so as to help churn and transport food through peristalsis. And cardiac muscle exists in the animal's heart, where the regular paced contractions pump and circulate blood throughout the animal's body. If you imagine me putting together an animal as I describe its components, so far we would have the bones and ligaments, the muscles and tendons, the blood, and the epithelial tissue that forms the veins, the skin, and the outer layers of all the organs. Now I'll get to the organs in a moment, but first I need to cover the last type of tissue, which innervates everything else. Neural tissue is composed of neurons and the associated entourage of support cells, which function to channel action potentials through the animal's body. Nerves are connected to sensor cells in the skin, in the eyes, ears, tongue, and nose. Nerves innervate muscle that connect to veins and reach within every single organ. The neural tissue descending from the brain and extending from the spinal cord facilitates sensory perception, body awareness, and homeostasis. Now, before we get into homeostasis, the entire point of running through this big long list of tissues and all of their structural traits and qualities was to demonstrate the relationship between form and function at the level of cells and tissues. The epithelial cells are flat, and together they form layered sheets of tissue that offer flexibility, durability, and mechanical protection, and so they form your skin and the outer layers of your organs and your blood vessels. The neurons have long axons and branching dendrites and the ability to propagate action potentials at high speed and high efficiency thanks to their myelination. And these structural traits facilitate more connections with other neurons and better innervation of other tissues. Speaking of tissues, loose connective tissue is made of that loose, really stringy fibrous material, and this casual, irregular structure gives it the flexibility and the sponginess that it needs to protect the organ or internal structure from the pressures and torques and mechanical insults that the outer epithelial layers are exposed to. Denser connective tissue is similar, but because of the higher abundance and the higher density of the fibers, this creates tissue that retains some degree of flexibility, but it has much higher strength and durability. And this makes this an ideal tissue type for connecting the heavier parts of the animal body, like the bones or the muscles. These heavier, stronger tissues experience a lot more damage, a lot more wear and tear, a lot heavier forces throughout the animal's life. So the tissues holding it all together, the tape keeping the bones together and the muscles connected to the bones, that tape has to be really strong. And you can trace this strength at the macroscopic scale right down to the rows of molecular fibers within the cells. Each example demonstrates the relationship between form and function. And this diversity of tissues, arranged in whatever order or proportion, gives us all of the animal diversity on the planet. The structure or form of these tissues also facilitates deeper regulatory processes at the body scale, which keeps the animal organism alive. Now, this principle applies to all tissues, but I'm using this as a way to come back around to neural tissue, in the form of stringy nerves and knot-like ganglia innervating all the other body tissues, and how this structural quality, this form, allows the animal's body to maintain homeostasis, which is a very important function. Homeostasis, in other words, is how the chemical superstructure that is the animal's body maintains its internal conditions and processes so that the body stays alive, so that the superstructure keeps humming along through time. To introduce homeostasis, I find myself returning to the same foundational principle I mentioned at the very beginning of the episode, that form follows function. The animal's physical shape and its mass has to obey physical rules over heat exchange and diffusion and other such variables, and so the diversity of evolved morphologies they've all been built, they've all been designed around these physical principles. Perhaps at its most basic is the animal's raw size. Now, this may be a simple quality, but it's hugely important. As volume increases faster than surface area, volume is cubed, surface area is squared, a larger animal will have a much larger volume to surface area ratio than a smaller animal. So this means that larger animals will generally retain their heat better than smaller animals, as there's more volume producing heat, and there's less surface area per cubic centimeter per volume of biomass through which to lose that heat. It's very interesting to notice, for example, that Arctic mammals tend to be rather large compared to their more temperate peers, like how moose are much larger than horses, and how polar bears are much larger than virtually every other type of bear. Furthermore, larger animals tend to have lower basal metabolic rates. The basal metabolic rate is the rate of oxygen consumption of the animal's body, measured in unit volume per unit biomass per unit time, when the animal is at rest in normal conditions. It's been documented that larger animals actually have a lower BMR than smaller animals, or that larger animals overall have a slower metabolic rate than smaller animals. This is also due to the physical rules of diffusion. In a small animal, like a little gecko or a shrew or a bat, the volume of their body is small enough and the surface area of all of the body's tissues being so closely integrated that nutrients and oxygen and waste products can diffuse across tissues relatively easily. This ease of diffusion enables a much faster metabolic rate. It enables a much faster rate of resource consumption, processing, utilization, recycling, and then excretion. And so smaller animals find themselves rapidly burning through nutrients. The metachemical cycle that forms the persistent superstructure of their bodies, it operates on a much faster clip than it does in larger animals. In larger animals, the tissues are literally larger and they're more spread out, and so on average, there's much less vascularization per unit volume. There's relatively less surface area of organs and skin and other structures, and all of that because volume increases with size at a cubed rate, while surface area increases with size at a squared rate. In some circumstances, this can actually be a problem for larger organisms. So consider an animal that breathes through its skin, where its skin effectively represents the surface area of its body. The oxygen that the animal breathes through the surface of its skin is used to feed the metabolic activity of its cells, which compose its internal volume. If the animal grows too large, the volume will increase faster than the surface area to the point where the diffusion of oxygen across the skin, across the surface area, will not be sufficient to keep all of the cells in the body, in the volume, alive. Salmon, for example, have to deal with this problem as they grow from tiny, skin-breathing larvae into an adult that breathes through its gills. And it does this through a process which sees their body mass increase by 1,000,000-fold. To deal with this problem caused by growing in size, the salmon transition sometime in their development from skin breathing to gill breathing. The gills are an adaptation that maximizes surface area so as to aid in respiration, just like the alveoli in the lungs of land-dwelling vertebrates. Gills are composed of numerous sheets of cells, called gill lamellae, and the composite structure built of numerous lamellae has a relatively large surface area, which makes them ideal for absorbing oxygen out of the water. This rate of absorption is facilitated by the high surface area, and it supports the growth of a larger volume or a larger body size in the salmon. Other adaptations to increase surface area involve folding or branching patterns. The digestive system is a great example of folding. Inside the small intestine, the inner epithelial layers are heavily folded and rippled so as to increase surface area for nutrient absorption. At the microscopic scale, this epithelium is also composed of villi and microvilli, which are small and smaller protrusions in the epithelial surface that greatly increases its surface area. Macroscopically, the small intestine is folded and rolled up into a bundle, so a very long tube can fit in a relatively small space. The branching patterns are most often seen in vasculature or in nervous tissue. If you look at a tree, it has a very obvious branching effect. From a single large trunk splits increasing numbers of increasingly small branches. This is very similar to the structure of blood vessels, like how large arteries branch into smaller arterioles, which branch into even smaller capillaries. Or how thick nerve bundles branch down to the individual neurons, each with their own dendrites branching out to connect in a network or circuit system with other neurons. In the case of veins, the high surface area of the branching enables efficient diffusion of nutrients throughout the body's tissue, throughout the body's volume. In the case of neural tissue, the high surface area of the branching enables sufficient innervation of the body's tissues, of the volume. So now that I've constructed, more or less, the entire organism with all of these different layers and tissue types, now it all has to work together to keep itself alive. And this is done by maintaining an internal homeostasis. So that was a long loop around, but we came back to homeostasis. This internal homeostasis is where the internal chemical conditions of the animal's body are maintained in a way that keeps it alive and healthy. Animals have evolved various mechanisms to maintain their homeostasis, even if the external environment is changing. There are, generally speaking, two strategies for maintaining homeostasis. These are conformation and regulation. In the conformation strategy, the animal conforms its body to its environment. This is the case for animals like the Arctic rock cod, which lives in the cold depths of the Arctic Ocean, where the temperature remains pretty constant. Instead of wasting energy trying to maintain a warmer body temperature than the external environment, the Arctic rock cod simply lets the ambient water temperature maintain its own body temperature, so it just conforms to its external environment. Now, regulation, on the other hand, is a much more active process. The animal expends energy to maintain the same internal temperature regardless of the external temperature, and it does this by engaging in regulating cellular or behavioral responses. If an animal is too hot, it may pant or sweat so as to get rid of excess heat through water evaporation. If an animal is too cold, it may shiver so as to generate heat through its muscles, or it may burrow to seek the warmth of soil blanketed in snow. I should point out that epithelial tissue is really important in a lot of these responses, as epithelial tissue forms the interface between the animal and its external environment, or between an organ and the rest of the body. Maintaining homeostasis and having epithelial tissue that can contribute to that is really important. This is because the animal possesses enzymes and other kinds of biochemicals that engage in reactions only under a very specific set of circumstances, like in the proper acidity or in the proper temperature range. When the animal's internal conditions start to move out of any of these comfort zones for any reason, the body receives sensory feedback and engages in regulatory responses. To keep it brief, a sensor, like a thermoreceptor or a nociceptor in the skin, will detect an input from the external environment, like temperature or a damaging stimulus, respectively. This sensor will feed information to the integrator, which is a structure or a group of structures that facilitates the response to the input, and the effectors are any structures used to go about enforcing or manifesting this response. This is a process of negative feedback, where any environmental input that pushes the animal out of homeostasis will cause a feedback response that tries to limit that change and pull the animal back into homeostasis. A couple quick examples: if an animal is hot, it might sweat or pant to get rid of heat by evaporation. If an animal is thirsty, for example, its internal osmolarity is a bit thrown off, perhaps there's too many solutes in its blood, in its tissues, the animal will be thirsty and it will seek out water to restore that osmotic balance. I want to take a closer look at heat management, because heat management is a near universal thing that primarily land-based animals have to deal with, and because it also deals with biology building upon physical laws. The physical laws involve the movement of heat through a medium, and how heat can be released or lost to the environment. Now, there are several ways to do this. Conduction and convection involves heat moving from one mass into another through direct physical contact. Conduction is the flow of heat through solids, like your stovetop to your frying pan. Convection is the flow of heat through a fluid medium, like water or air, which is how your oven bakes the chicken you eat for dinner. And then there's radiation, which is heat lost as infrared radiation into the environment. Perhaps most important for animals is evaporation, where heat is taken away as liquid water boils away to gas. By building off of these physical laws of heat flow, animals have evolved means of regulating their internal temperature, which is called thermoregulation. There's a really interesting dynamic here, where animals fall somewhere along two gradients. One gradient is concerned with how the tissue is heated. On one end, you have endotherms, which produce their own heat through metabolic activity, like mammals, and on the other end, you have ectotherms, which heat their body with the ambient heat of the environment, like reptiles. And then there's the other gradient concerned with heat management in the face of an unforgiving environment. On one end, you have homeotherms, which keep their internal temperature constant despite a warmer or colder external environmental temperature. And on the other end, you have heterotherms, which allow their body temperature to rise or fall in accordance with the external temperature. It's important to understand that very few, if any, animals exist at any of the extremes. Most animals have mixed responses to varying degrees. For example, a human out in the cold will generally see a decrease in internal body temperature, even after regulatory responses kick in to fight off the cold. So this involves mostly homeothermy, but a little bit of heterothermy. In contrast, a reptile engages in minor homeothermic regulation to avoid temperature extremes, but by and large will keep itself warm with the hot tropical air and the high noon sun. The point is, animals usually don't work in absolutes. Animals like mammals and birds have relatively fast metabolic rates, with the activity of their cells generating enough heat to keep their bodies warm. Reptiles have much lower metabolic rates, and they warm themselves by lying on hot rocks or by being in the sun. But, like all adaptations, there are fitness trade-offs here. The endotherms, like mammals and birds, have to eat an absolutely huge amount of food to sustain their high metabolic rate, and thus their body temperature, while ectotherms are sensitive to low temperatures, and this can drop their metabolism to the point that they become sluggish and lethargic, even vulnerable to predation. Certain morphological structures are also used for heat regulation. Large, thin, heavily vascularized ears, like you'd find on a fennec fox or an elephant, are good for losing heat, as warm blood will circulate through this thin tissue and dissipate heat out into the air. The large surface area makes them great for radiating and convecting away heat. The blood vessels themselves are also used to move heat through a mechanism called countercurrent exchange. For example, parallel blood vessels running through a limb will carry blood in opposite directions, blood coming down the limb from the body, and blood moving from the tip of the limb back towards the body. And as this blood moving in opposite directions passes each other, or because you have these parallel veins with countercurrent flow, they'll exchange their heat in such a way so as to establish a stable temperature gradient. So this concept is a little difficult, so let me try and illustrate it for you. So say we had a limb, like a leg or an arm, and there's blood vessels going down, carrying blood down to the fingers or the feet or whatever, and there's blood vessels bringing that blood back to the body, back to the heart. Say that there's some kind of strange tissue there that heat cannot pass through, and it separates the vessels going down from the body to the tip of the limb from the vessels going from the tip of the limb back to the body. If these parallel vessels with current flow going in opposite directions, if they can't exchange heat, then what happens? Let's just think about this. So you have warm blood flowing from the core of the body down the limb. Now the limb is smaller than the body, obviously, and so it's got a larger surface area in proportion to its volume. This means that more heat is going to be lost out of the limb, especially as the blood vessels get down to like the fingers or the toes, where heat just pours out because the surface area to volume ratio gets much bigger. Now at this point, if the heat is really flowing out of the blood at the tip of the limb, then the blood flowing from the tip of the limb back to the body is going to be pretty cold, right? If there's no heat from the body being dumped into this cold blood coming back from the tip of the limb, then by the time that blood makes it back to the core of the body, it's still going to be really cold, and that's actually going to cool the core of the body down, and that can be harmful. That can cause the animal to go into hypothermia and die if its core body temperature goes down. To illustrate the benefits of this countercurrent exchange system, let's remove that theoretical tissue that blocked heat exchange. So now we do have heat exchange through these countercurrent flows. So as warm blood moves from the core of our body down to the tip of the limb, it cools off. But that blood moving back up to the body will pass some of the warm blood coming into the limb. And as it does so, some of that heat will flow back into this cold blood coming back from the tip of the limb. So by the time the blood flows back into the core of the body, it's been warmed back up, and the core body temperature remains stable. Now there are 1,000 different ways that animals regulate heat, from cellular processes to macroscopic morphology and even specific behaviors. There are thousands of more ways that animals regulate all sorts of things, like their osmolarity, their respiratory rate, their digestive wastes, you name it. Maintaining homeostasis is critically important and virtually all-encompassing, involving almost every part of the animal's chemical and physical physiology. These are all examples of form following function, as the biological substrate evolves to grow around and exploit a framework of physical laws. These are the fundamentals of animal physiology, the fundamentals of animal form and function. And with that, we've come to the end of the episode. This was a really long episode, but it was also a really interesting episode, and the information presented here is really important for you to understand, because it applies to pretty much every aspect of how animal bodies work and what influences are directing and shaping their evolution. Subscribe to the channel so that you can join me when I post the next episode in this series on animal physiology part 2. The next episode will be on animal gas exchange. So if you want to learn all about animal respiration, how animals use and move gases through their tissues, how they breathe, the different strategies they've used to adapt to different environments to do that, then subscribe and join me next time. And as always, thank you for listening.